Welcome to Who the Fuck Are Arctic Monkeys, the podcast where we chat to interesting people about their favourite song from the Titular Lads from High Green as well as much more. This week I was joined by Aaron Brown, a man who's been a close collaborator of the group since he began working with them as a videographer during the Suck It and See sessions. Following on from that, the group and Aaron have continued to work together on music videos and promotional materials for all their albums since. He took me behind the scenes and creative process of that work, talking through the cinematic influences of AM, the ragtag nature with which he approached the videos on Suck It and See, and exploring dual personalities and locations out with time on his work for Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino. Beyond that, we touched upon the group's move from the UK to LA, how Aaron sees their personalities feeding into their music, and the wonder of witnessing a music video coming together in the editing space. But before all of that, he shares his favourite track from the group's 6th album discography. Here's me and Aaron Brown talking all things Arctic Monkeys.
I think the one I chose, it's kind of has to do with Alex's ability to kind of pull off one-liners. So I chose That's Where You're Wrong from Suck It and See.
That whole album really is a kind of testament to what you're saying there with his ability to pull off one-liners. You have complete songs, That's Where You're Wrong being one of them, where it's just every line is like a home run.
Yeah. I feel like that aspect of them says more about the band too, because when you're around them, that's sort of how they exist. They're just these sort of jokes that snowball into kind of absurdity, but then you kind of, when you see the artwork that they make, you see that it's not just sort of for their own satisfaction. It's kind of like going somewhere, or at least the fun that they have together kind of becomes this something that's bigger, you know? So it's kind of, and then it gets written out in these one-liners and they're really inspiring and moving. And then of course they put music to it or vice versa. But
I suppose it allows their personality to translate quite directly into the music too then.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it's kind of, because they all do it, you know. It's not just Al. Like, you know, Matt's hysterical and Nick just is full of one-liners, and like sometimes Jamie's the funniest of all. You know, it's there's no hierarchy in terms of humor with them, but they all kind of have their own style. You see it through Al and the lyrics, but it's a representation of all of them, and I think that's why they're so tight, you know.
In terms of playing wise too, you kind of just see that chemistry translate.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because they've been doing it for a long time now. It's crazy. Most people can't do that.
Yeah, 16 years or something. I mean, since they were kids.
Yeah, it's wild. Yeah.
What memories does That's Where You're Wrong evoke for you?
I suppose that's when I first met him. So Ben Chappell, who we did Focus Creeps and did a lot of work with Monkeys. We first met him when they were making that record. They were doing a song a day, I remember, in the studio. And I think they were tracking it in a sort of minimalist way with James Ford. I think they would only use 8 tracks, or I can't remember what it was, but then they would punch in overdubs and stuff, kind of like how they would do it in the olden days. So we met them and they were really nice in the studio. They were really sort of hospitable, and Ben and I sort of stumbled in the studio and kind of took the time to sit down and talk. And then we showed up on the She's Thunderstorms day, and then that was kind of the first interaction with them, I guess.
How did you link up? What was the connection?
So we have worked with Domino Records on various other projects. Our buddy Morgan, who works for Domino in the United States, just reached out and said that they wanted to capture some stuff of the guys in the studio. Yeah, so we just rolled over there, you know, just to kind of do a little sort of behind the scenes capturing of stuff. And then, you know, one thing led to another, and they were going to do it again another day. And then we sort of started filming and taking pictures. And that was kind of a time when Ben and I would just kind of have a grab bag of film cameras and, you know, digital lo-fi cameras and point and shoot stuff, just 10 cameras in a bag or something. And we're just have 3 things dangling from our neck, and we're just sort of hosing it down. And that sort of led to, you know, Brick by Brick, and then Don't Sit Down, and I can't even remember now. the Shallow La La one. There was kind of a live thing. It was just sort of, we would just roll around with them in LA, and then went over to London and then Sheffield, and would just sort of photograph and film stuff, and then would make videos with it later.
It's interesting, you mention the idea of LA and then also Sheffield, where they're from, in these different two quite opposing locations. Because there's a quote from you that I really love where you said before that you'd rather be told what the story is by the location than tell the story with a pile of props.
Mm-hmm.
How did you see that kind of feeding into those videos with those two opposing places?
I think there's always been a fun romance between LA and England. I think that at least, you see this kind of funny journey with artists where they sort of leave England for LA as this sort of refuge. But it's a funny thing to do because it's so different. It's hard to know if you would like it, and for me, I think I identify with that because I always really admired a lot of artists from England, and where does that admiration come from? How would I really know that I would even like somewhere like that, or idealizing a place that you've never been? Something about it just sort of evokes a lot in our respective imaginations, I think. So I got a chance to, live over there, and they got a chance to live in LA. And I think at that time in our lives, it was just a funny kind of opposites attract.
I guess the key word you mentioned there too is imagination, and that you kind of impart your own ideas of what it's going to be onto the place. What makes that a little bit more magical.
Yeah. Yeah. Because, here's a funny sort of sobering example is that, in my case, you go to somewhere like England, you go to somewhere like Yorkshire, you go to somewhere like, or like Scotland, where you think of Scotland, you just, bands just don't stop kind of emerging from your memory. How could a place as small as Scotland create so many kind of artistic bands, of all kinds of genres and stuff. And then you go to Yorkshire or you go to Scotland, and sooner or later you have to admit to yourself it's pretty boring. There's nothing going on, and it's sort of cold and boring, and people are funny and nice, but they're also kind of closed off too. So you start to realize, it's all in your head. All this stuff is your imagination, but it's also a product of that boredom. I would imagine, if you get bored, you go inward and you sort of tell jokes, and you pick up an instrument or pick up a pencil or whatever. And it's one of the most inspired places creatively, but at the same time, you don't experience that when you're there, just sort of, bumming around and doing, it's not like an extroverted thing. It's very internal and, imaginal or something.
Yeah.
You're saying.
And I think part of it too is what we kind of started off talking about with the notion of moving to LA. Part of it is perhaps fueled by this desire for escapism and bands trying to get out of this place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And what better landscape to put that, those, imaginary fantasies than LA. I mean, because you're not alone there. Everybody does. Everybody does it to LA. I didn't grow up in LA, so it's this funny kind of place. Like a lot of people say, it's like the last stop on the train. It's like if you're unsettled or you're moved by your imagination, like you don't stop until you kind of have to in LA. There's nowhere else to go. You've gone everywhere. So there you are. Do you go for it and like sort of go for the big thing? Or there's also this really rich kind of underground artistic scene that you discover there. And LA becomes this thing that's much bigger and much more sort of multifaceted than you're told as an outsider. So then it's kind of, then you have to ask yourself, do I like this? Do I like what LA actually is? And I think it's not as exciting, I don't know, than it may have been even just 10 years ago. I think things have gone online, and you can be creative in different ways. You don't have to like chase this kind of narrative that LA sort of fulfills.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but I feel like that's the vision that we kind of still have of LA, even though that died 50 years ago.
Yeah, totally. That really kind of nails the sort of poles of the light and dark of a place like LA, you know, because when you create so much star power, it'll inevitably create some comparable sort of underbelly of equal or greater size, you know, which we find in the Manson characters.
It's really a kind of point in history when you're able to see that dichotomy of the city on full view at the most extreme version of it.
Yeah, and you see, I mean, it's cool how the guys you saw them sort of orbit around that fantasy of LA because they spent a lot of time there and they really sort of settled into it, but then they sort of orbited back to, of course, you know, so you get AM, right? So it's a big kind of public celebrated event, which was created in LA. It was kind of created.
Feels like a very American record.
Yeah. And then you sort of see him kind of the gravitational pull go really deep, dark back into this kind of symbolist sci-fi sort of slowed down inner, more or less like psychedelic sound of tranquility. And it's kind of that you just start to see like the extremes of what they're possible or what they're capable of, but also that I would say reflects like anyone when they're sort of driven or sort of committed to following that fantasy, say like somebody from England would be to LA, and the whole culture and the whole persona that you create with something like that. And then it sort of snaps back, taking them down, deep, dark down back to, you know, the European continent. You know, it's kind of a funny thing. And that's what we're kind of exploring in the Tranquility videos, is like the split that happened. You know, there's this sort of the genuine creative inner artist, and then there's the kind of who's kind of shaggy and, you know, and has a beard and stuff, and then of course the kind of built up outward facing character that's clean shaven and kind of has, you know, primary colors, and they're very contrasted colors, whereas the bearded one's a bit more earth tones and things like that, you know. Because you kind of hanging out with them, you see the ability they've had to develop to be able to go back and forth, you know, kind of, and it's hard. It's not many people can do that without just burning out.
When it comes to those videos too, I heard that you lived in the house that 4 out of 5 was shot in for a little while too.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, I was dating Grania, who was family ancestry was associated with that house and still is. They still do an amazing job at you know, stewarding that property and, you know, generating interest in it. And it's such a beautiful place. It's an inspiring place.
Does it feel a little bit like time travel? Does it feel quite preserved in a different time? Yeah,
that's a good point. It's that tension of those kind of poles where it's like you're in the past, but you're in the present, and it's just constantly pulling at you. And for somebody like me who, you know, grew up in California, that's probably one of the newest places in the world in terms of whatever kind of culture we live in. Of course, there's people that live here and have lived here for a long time that live differently than we do. But, you know, in the case of, you know, the culture that we live in, California is very young. There's not a lot of old buildings, let's say. So you go somewhere like that, and it really provokes a lot of feelings you've never felt before. And of course, coincidence that it's right next to Sheffield, more or less. I mean, it's an hour away.
Oh, I didn't realize that, actually.
Yeah, it's in Yorkshire. It's like right next to York. That was a weird point of conversation that we kept sort of going back and forth about, because we didn't know if we wanted to film it there or not. You know, did it seem obvious? Did it seem like we had to do it? Or did it seem like we absolutely shouldn't, you know? So we kind of kept, you know, ping-ponging back and forth. I think that we were actually pretty decided for a while that we weren't going to. It's kind of late in the game. I think Al called it, and he's like, no, actually, we have to do it there. So that was what was fun about the Tranquility stuff, because it felt so so intuitive. Everything was almost like psychic or something. And, because it was made by the character in the beard, of course, it's a very kind of
otherworldly.
Yeah. And sort of like primitive and, just sort of raw, but also really elevated. And the inspirations, you can tell his references, you never know where they're going to come from, but he's such a good prism of sort of channeling references into a unified kind of confident music. But in that case, there were just these really disparate references. So you had to have faith in these kind of like psychic truths that would sort of emerge in these irrational ways. Whereas like, of course, AM was very kind of felt more deliberate, although there are times when it didn't, when they were making it. But so when he said, we got to do it at the castle, it was like a light bulb went off. It was like, okay, this is like a lily pad that we've just come across in a sort of dark lake of unknowing, just kind of trusting in whatever came to us or through him or just through talking and stuff.
It's kind of fascinating, this line of conversation we've gone down to, because when we look at that, their kind of musical progression, from Suck It and See to AM to Tranquility Base.
Yeah, exactly.
It's almost paralleled in the videos in a sense that with Suck It and See, you were very much kind of just capturing the reality of what was happening there. You said filming them in the studio and stuff and on the road. Mm-hmm. And then Tranquility Base, you're at the complete opposite end of the spectrum where you're crafting this entire alternate world and building something. AM kind of falls between them. Is that like a line you think that we can kind of draw on your progression working with them through the 3 records?
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah, I mean, it was almost as if Suck It and See was a sort of verite kind of just hanging out documentary like period of just sort of getting to know each other and sort of feeling out each other's feelings and just sort of what jokes and
finding a rhythm of working together.
Yeah. But it was very casual, you can almost say it's just very of the world or of the place or sort of exo like outside, just being places, seeing things, being observant, and making connections, just kind of free associative based on where we were, what was happening. I feel like there's a more succinct way to put this, but it's like a poet who like writes poems about like a bicycle or something, and then everything is sort of metaphor, based on like objects or the world around you.
Like that Jim Jarmusch movie Patterson.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. That kind of attitude, right? Kind of like poetry in the mundane, and using certain cameras that like saturate the world around you, things like that. Kind of realism, I guess. And then AM, like we didn't do that much. We did Are You Mine, and then we did the Snap Out of It.
That's the one with the girl in the video, isn't it?
The pool. Yeah, and that's more kind of, materialist feeling and stuff. Sort of like emotions are trying to like break through some materialist environment, right? And she doesn't really have the skills to do it. She's sort of falling apart because something's sort of emerging that wants to be seen, or like a regret or something unresolved. But it's like, when you live in a materialist place like LA, you don't really have the tools to just sort of bring your feelings into your everyday life, because sometimes your feelings don't agree with how you're living your life or something, So then, of course, with Tranquility, then we go deep down into the world of feelings and just like images and sort of symbolism, and that's hard, and I'll admit I'm not the most skilled to do that. It takes a lot of extra work for me, whereas some other people just kind of, it comes to them and they don't doubt the imagery. They don't hesitate to sort of integrate it into a larger narrative. Whereas for me, that kind of stuff's not easy. It's kind of like painful.
Do you sculpt a lot of that in the editing process?
Yeah, I mean, editing's a bizarre tool. I've always said, especially with stuff like that, like the editors sort of like the talk therapist, and you're sort of sitting on the couch and eventually like laying down so stressed out that like you didn't get enough of this, or you should have done this, and like now it's too late, and what have I done, and this isn't going to work. And then the editor sort of reveals some, connection within the imagery that, is kind of cooler than what you would have ever thought of in the first place. And
it's all about context.
Yeah, you just sit bolt right up, like just exhilarated and ready to face the world again. It's pretty cool. The editing process is pretty magical, really. I mean, it's like sorcery.
Yeah, just kind of watching. I mean, I imagine particularly on something like Suck It and See, when you're kind of just capturing what's happening in front of you, when you see that kind of take shape in a narrative sense with the way that some of those videos do come together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. I mean, it's a really unsettling and exciting thing to just sort of rearrange time at your own kind of will, or sort of, caprice or something. It's just like, you're like, oh, I'm going to move this thing that happened later in the beginning just because I can, and you can't do that in life.
Well, sculpting in time, it was what Tarkovsky called, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's quite a thing.
I'm intrigued, just to kind of a couple more to wrap us up. What techniques do you think can you use to kind of unlock or unveil the world of a song and the world of a music video when you're in that stage of trying to figure it out? That's
a good question. I think the way, and this is a personal answer, I've always had the most fulfilling experiences when I can just work directly with the artist. That's not something that happens all the time. And even just a phone call, if you can kind of hear where the song came from, it's kind of like you're sort of, sculpting. You kind of, but it's almost like, where did the idea come from for the song? And then you're sort of stepping into this sort of stream, I guess, of some kind of muse. You're trying to do that thing justice, So if you can hear from the artist, like how it found them, through their personal experiences or through something that inspired them that they can explicitly remember, then you start sort of free associating through, imagery. Usually it provokes something between the two people or whoever's talking on the phone or in the room. And you kind of start going, I don't think it's ever not worked, but that's also not how the music video industry is really set up right now. Usually they'll send out a brief and stuff, and then you got to write a treatment, and those kind of fall flat because it's kind of like a lot of me and like some random idea, but that might have struck me at that time when the song arrived in the inbox. But I think the best stuff comes when a label or management or something will get the artist to talk to, the creatives about what the song's about,
How has the common language that you share with Outer Monkeys and the way that you communicate with them changed over the course of the last 10 years?
It hasn't and it hasn't. I mean, we're still the same people. I think being that we're not around each other as much, that sort of intimate humor has withered, but I in no way do I imagine that it's, not possible to, recapture. But I think in place of that, when we do hang out, there is a kind of a depth that we can kind of explore if and when it's about, creative stuff. But otherwise, I don't know, there's just so many lanes of shared interests that we've sort of established over time, whether it's cameras, of course, I mean, cameras alone have been such a big thing because they've, in their own way become users and collectors of cameras. But then music is always a way of, kind of exploring things. And then movies, just music, cameras and movies and instruments is kind of enough to go on for a while.